guys, how are you today? So today we're moving into chapter 18, and this will kind of talk about chapter 18 section 1 and about chapter 18 section 2 a little bit as well. So just to kind of get you thinking about the topic of the civil rights movement, think about what you already know about this. I'm sure that you already have some background information. Have you heard about, I'm sure you've heard of Martin Luther King before. Obviously we get a day off school in January for him. But I'm not sure if you've ever heard of people like Malcolm X, or groups that they created like the SCLC or SNCC or CORE. So we're going to be talking about basically what gets the civil rights movement to begin and kind of how it develops today. And then on Thursday, we'll kind of talk about Malcolm X and kind of how it splits off into the Black Power movement, how Martin Luther King is assassinated, and kind of how it dies down. And then later this week, we'll be talking about the role of the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s. And then this last unit will be coming to a close. Make sure you're working on your project and stuff this week. That's your big assignment for this week. And then you're also kind of doing some book work as well. So the book assignment that you have to do this week, remote learners, is reading page 625, numbers 1 through 3. And you're reading about this court case called Brown versus Board of Education. And there is this student, her name is Linda Brown. You can see her, she's a cute little kid. And her parents are upset because she has to ride multiple buses and walk many miles across town to attend school in Topeka, Kansas. And so her parents, as well as many other parents, were suing the school district. And the school district said, well, you can't come to this school. It's a white school. You have to cross town to go to the black school, and according to, the Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896, which established that as long as there are separate but equal facilities for whites and blacks, we're allowed to have segregation. Well, this case makes its way through the court system and eventually makes it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And Chief Justice Earl Warren is going to be overseeing this case and arguing for Linda Brown. And the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, will be this man by the name of Thurgood Marshall, who's one of the most famous lawyers of all time. And he says this is a violation of her 14th Amendment rights, that there is no reason why she should have to attend a school across town, especially since the school is not equal in terms of quality to the white school. The students, lack, quality textbooks. The teachers are of an inferior quality. It helps create self-esteem issues, that students are told to believe that they're lesser people and that this is unconstitutional. Here's just some pictures of Thurgood Marshall and Chief Justice Earl Warren.
We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we unanimously hold that the plaintiffs are deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Plessy v. Ferguson in education is no more, and in practice, Plessy v. Ferguson itself is no more. The era of Jim Crow, constitutionally speaking, is over.
So as he kind of, articulated, basically the Supreme Court strikes down Plessy versus Ferguson. It says separate is not equal. Segregation pretty much is illegal. And in upcoming court cases where they kind of settle some other statutes, they state that all public schools should be integrated, with all deliberate speed, and you cannot have separate schools anymore, at least at the public level. Maybe at the private level and the university level will be a whole different question altogether. So the other part of your book work is you're kind of reading not just the majority opinion of the court, but you're also reading the South's reaction to the Brown case. And 100 Southern states get together and they basically pledge to oppose Brown versus Board of Education, and they're pretty sneaky. They end up closing a bunch of public schools, and a lot of the whites in the South enroll their students in like private schools, like Christian schools. And obviously, the rules as far as integration haven't applied to them yet. They can kind of get away with it at this point, and so it's kind of a way to go around it. And they feel like segregation is a states' rights issue. They don't see it as being any kind of issue, and you can see kind of the people with the American flags and guns and race mixing is communist, and it goes against Christ, and people were very worked up about this. This is going to really be the beginning of the civil rights movement here. And so we also see that kind of violence starts spilling over against any African American in the South. For example, there's a boy by the name of Emmett Till. You can see him right here. Maybe, if my computer cooperates. Let me show you Emmett. Here he is. And that's what happens to Emmett. He is a boy from Chicago who's in Mississippi, and he gets beaten to death by some racist white Southerners who were Klan members. They actually confess to this murder, yet he is acquitted by an all-white jury. So you can kind of see that there's racism in all levels of life. There is what we call de jure segregation, which is the fact the laws themselves were racist, and there was, Jim Crow segregation in all areas of life. But there's also, de facto segregation, the idea that people are racist by custom and tradition, and to them, this was normal and it was acceptable. So we fast forward in the future to 1957, and, the Brown case here said in 56, you should be integrating schools with all deliberate speed, but what does that mean exactly? So it's going to get tested here in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas, where at the Little Rock, Arkansas High School, some African American students attempt to attend the high school to become students there. Well, Governor Orville Faubus, who is a huge racist, blocks the students from entering the school and literally just won't let them enter. And these kids get bullied, people scream at them, they yell stuff at them, they vandalize their property, they're terrified for their life, they get beat up, and they're just like, is it worth it to even go to this school? So General Eisenhower, our president at the time, he decides that even though he was not big on civil rights, he thought that segregation was going to end slowly over time. He was not a huge fan of the courts getting involved with the Brown decision. It sounds like he was definitely, somewhat racist, very conservative in his views on this issue. But he wasn't going to get involved. He was going to focus on the Cold War. He also had his heart attack at this time, though, so he was kind of not himself entirely. But he decides to send in the federal troops, to send in the army to protect these 9 black students, because you can't have a governor allowing violence and attacks on children.
In 1954, the Supreme Court had ordered the integration of all public schools in its famous decision Brown versus the Board of Education. 3 years later, that decision would be severely tested at Little Rock's all-white Central High School. Despite the federal court order, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus had no intention of allowing black students to attend Central High, and he ordered the Arkansas National Guard to surround the school. On September the 3rd, Melba Bees and 8 other black students walked towards Central High. One, Elizabeth Eckford, became separated from her friends and was surrounded by a white mob that included Ann Thompson.
There was just a lot of electricity in the air. It was almost a circus-like atmosphere. All these parents on the sideline urging us on and telling us, get out there, don't let them get in.
There are mobs on her heels, like dogs, nipping at her. Policemen are watching this. Every time she tries to step between them, they close ranks.
If Central High was to be integrated, it would have to be by order of the president. Eisenhower was at first reluctant to interfere.
His record on civil rights was not a good one until 1957, the crisis at Little Rock. And there, a fundamental question was dealt with. Do the states have the right to impose their own social order in defiance of federal court orders? Eisenhower answered it decisively, said, no, we have made a national commitment. We are going to desegregate this society. And if it takes the 101st Airborne to do it, so be it.
This is awful. It was, that is vivid still. And I could just see Little Rock just being in a state of siege by the troops,
So ultimately, the Army does come in and they're able to, protect these kids, get them to go to class, but unfortunately, they do have to stay there the rest of the year. And then the school district gets pretty sneaky. They actually close the school the following year. They close several schools, and yet again, we see hundreds of white students going to private schools to try to get around the decision. Cooper versus Aaron later that year also barred states from interfering in integration. It really settles that question about states' rights. The states do not have power and control over this. And, eventually by 1969, the Supreme Court eventually mandated the immediate integration of all public schools, of all private schools, saying this is not an issue you can control, this is racism, that it's not going to be easy. People are going to be reacting heavily with protests, with violence, with the KKK burning, crosses in people's yards. It's going to get people worked up, tensions rising. Many African Americans, more so than ever before, are moving to the north. Many did, during the second Great Migration during World War II, and that had given them some political power, some voting power. But, they're really going to be pushing for change. And so we're really on the cusp of change here while the Cold War is going on. Now, while all of this is going on with Brown versus Board of Education and kind of the integration in schools, the other part of the civil rights movement that is kicking off is really the integration in terms of public transportation and not just education. So it all starts really in 1955 when Rosa Parks, who I'm sure you've heard of it before, she refuses to give up her seat on the bus. The way that it worked was that, if the bus was full and African Americans were seated and whites were standing, they were expected to give up their seat for a white person. So the bus driver asked Rosa Parks, as well as two other people who were African American, sitting in the middle, after the white section, kind of towards the back, to give up their seats. And she refused. So the bus driver called the police. Now, Rosa Parks did this because she was angry. She refused to be silenced. She had some training in kind of civil rights movements and policies, but she wasn't necessarily trying to spark a movement per se. She gets arrested and go to jail, and the NAACP provides her with a lawyer, and they basically say, we would like to turn your case into a movement. We would like to use your case, which is gaining national attention by the media, into basically a springboard for change. And she's like, well, okay, if it's going to help. And so they're able to go to the best lawyers, they're able to get money, and she's also getting support from Martin Luther King Jr., a young pastor who has studied nonviolent protests, who wants to bring about change. And so he is going to be working with the Montgomery Improvement Association. They decide to lead the boycotts, where they literally convince, thousands of people who live in Montgomery, Alabama, and who ride the buses every day to get to work, to walk or to carpool. And just to show the bus companies that you need us, we don't need you, and you're going to lose thousands of dollars unless you change your policy. Now, by 1956, the court declares segregation in public transportation illegal. The boycott is successful. Eventually, obviously, the buses are integrated, and the buses realize that they made a major mistake, that they were losing tons of money. And Martin Luther King Jr. really becomes a national leader at this point. He's going to be working with a lot of churches in the area, and he creates a Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And as he kind of works with these local churches and makes the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he goes to these different churches and he starts making the message saying, if we band together as a group, we'll realize the Christian thing to do is to preach love and not hate. We need to protest. We need to work as a team. We can change America. We can change the way that African Americans are treated. If we work together as a group and we preach love, not hate, which of course goes along with, Christian messages anyway.
December the 1st, 1955, on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama, life began to change. By refusing to give up her seat to a white man, a tired seamstress named Rosa Parks quietly ignited a revolution.
The day that Rosa Parks was arrested, a low murmur went through the whole city. And overnight, this thing bloomed.
Led by a charismatic young preacher named Martin Luther King, the city's black community organized a peaceful boycott of the buses. They walked instead.
We will do it in an orderly fashion. This is a non-violent protest. We're depending on moral and spiritual forces.
White policemen responded by arresting black carpool drivers. White extremists bombed King's home.
Martin always said, you know, if you don't have anything that you die for, what do you have to live for?
So, they were taking immediate action against Martin Luther King Jr. and the members of the Montgomery Improvement Association, but he didn't let that violence stop him or scare him, and eventually, they're able to bring about change. And his message of nonviolent protests were really inspired by Mohandas Gandhi, who eventually led India to freedom from Great Britain by going on hunger strikes and such, and just refusing to attack back with violence. And over time, his efforts are going to help waken the spiritual conscience of people, especially during the attacks in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. President Kennedy will realize, even though he was reluctant to get involved in the civil rights movement, that you can't let, these police officers, arrest people without reason and attack people and mistreat children. And it's going to be harder to change that de facto segregation, people's minds and customs and traditions, but you can do it. You can awaken their conscience. You can show them that we're all human and we all deserve to be treated the same. It's just going to be taking a while. So as the civil rights movement heats up, we start to see that, technically, public transportation is supposed to be integrated. Yet in all reality, most of the South is resisting integration of buses. And so we're going to see the creation of this group called the Freedom Riders. And we're going to see lots of new groups being created. One of them is like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is going to be organizing students together to make protests. We're also going to have, we already mentioned the Montgomery Improvement Association and SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So Montgomery Improvement Association was just about Montgomery and their buses. The Southern Christian Leadership Conferences is more like a bunch of churches working together to stop, basically racism. SNCC, which I'll talk a little bit more about, is all about students coming together, like on college campuses, at the high school level, but just young people working, to stop racism. And we're also going to have this other group called CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and they're going to work on trying to stop racism through a lot of like sit-ins where they refuse to leave places unless they're served, even though they are African American, and those restaurants refuse to serve African Americans. So these Freedom Riders, they're kind of more in close association with SNCC, with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they basically decide they're going to get on buses and they are going to, get on buses further north where basically, people are accepting that, now black and white buses are integrated. And, as those buses are supposed to be going, let's say, from Chicago to Alabama or wherever in the South, they're purposely going to ride them so that as they ride into town, they're going to basically force the law to come true. They're going to force integration. They're pushing the issue. Well, as you can see in this picture, look what happened to their bus. Clearly, they must have stopped to go to the bathroom or got something to eat, and somebody blew up their bus. And you can see some of those people are injured and upset. And you might say, well, are they going to stop their efforts? Are they going to stop, these rides? And the answer is no. The president is very worried about this situation and as it's blowing up. So what President Kennedy decides to do is, as the riders are going throughout the South, he is going to ask, basically, the governor to protect these people. But he says you may arrest them and claim that they are breaking your laws, that they're somehow, riling up, disrupting the peace. So you can arrest them, but you need to protect them and make sure they are safe. And, this is kind of going to be somewhat protecting them to make sure they're safe. If these people get out to go to the bathroom or get something to eat, they're probably still going to get beaten or attacked or potentially raped. But the idea is they're not going to get murdered. Their whole bus isn't going to get blown up. It's not going to be in the national news. It's not going to really, be something that's a black mark on Kennedy's presidency. And he really has been more affected by the civil rights movement during the last, 6 months of his presidency, when he starts to realize, there needs to be a call for change, at the national level, as there's now a bigger focus on integrating buses, but all transportation facilities and waiting rooms and restrooms, etc. And eventually, as I said, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, they're going to work towards integrating restaurants and lunch counters so that those places are serving blacks and whites. So are the freedom rides successful? Somewhat, somewhat not. They're going to continue on. African Americans, despite getting bullied and attacked, they are going to continue to ride throughout the South to push for more federal protection to ensure that they really can have true integration. And eventually, Kennedy is going to give them more support and kind of stop them from getting arrested. That's going to be kind of a path as well. Steps the freedom riders will have to take as they're on these freedom rides, trying to show America that buses deserve to be integrated, and they're going to do whatever it takes as they are riders on these buses trying to bring about freedom and liberty. Now, all of the protests and movements during this era are not successful. For example, Martin Luther King will get arrested twice as he's trying to desegregate Albany, Georgia. This protest in general failed. It was nonviolent, but it didn't really bring about any change. There was a lot of local laws there and people who were incredibly racist. President Kennedy does call for Martin Luther King's removal from jail, though, realizing that he was thrown in jail for no reason and that it was, a great violation of his liberties. And President Kennedy starts to realize that if there's someone who can stir the nation, or I should say, push the nation in the right direction in terms of civil rights, it's Martin Luther King Jr.
In 1961, the author James Baldwin wrote, "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage all the time."
It was two worlds, a black world and a white world. As a young child, I remember very well seeing the signs, and I resented it.
If you went to the Dairy Queen, white people would go in and sit down. You got your ice cream at a window.
I never rode a bus because I knew I'd have to sit in the back. I didn't go downtown to the movie theaters because I'd have to sit in the Jim Crow gallery.
I remember on one occasion I tried to go to the county library, and we couldn't even go in and check out of a book.
That did not change until the Civil Rights Movement.
In the early 1960s, young people would take the lead in the battle for racial equality. Federal courts had ruled that segregated waiting areas in bus stations were illegal, but the law was not being enforced. To pressure the Kennedy administration to intervene, activists rode public buses into the Deep South to integrate the facilities. Outside of Anniston, Alabama, the bus carrying the first group of self-proclaimed freedom riders was firebombed.
By the time the freedom ride started, there was a realization that some of us would have to die and that we should not fear death. And we liken this very much to military service, that if you serve your country in the military, you might lose your life.
And that was a pretty scary reaction and viewpoint these people had, but they were willing to do anything to integrate, the buses and the waiting areas in some of these facilities, and it was very noble. And if you notice, there were African Americans and whites who were part of this movement trying to bring about change in America. So the next big issue to really talk about is what happens in Birmingham, Alabama. And in Birmingham, Alabama, the goal is to basically desegregate Birmingham, which is one of the most racist cities in the South. And it is under the control of a police chief by the name of Bull Connor. And Bull, or Bull Moose Connor, as he was called, is a huge racist. We know for a fact that as students were, freedom riders going through Alabama, and they were trying to integrate, the buses and the waiting rooms and the restrooms and the whole thing, he called members of the Ku Klux Klan and invited them to Birmingham and said, beat up the freedom riders till they're black and blue. Bring in dogs to bite them. Do whatever you want and I won't arrest you. He later denied it, but evidence proved later that he was angry. He used fire hoses on children and on just innocent people who were protesting under Martin Luther King's leadership in this very nonviolent way. And it was literally like so rough that it was taking their skin off. This was when JFK saw this on TV. And, he had done a few things, as I mentioned before, to help the Freedom Riders. But otherwise, he had tried to stay out of it. Brown versus Board of Education, the Little Rock Nine, Rosa Parks, and the initial bus boycott, all that happened during Eisenhower's presidency. And so far, with these Freedom Riders, the president hadn't really been too involved. He tried to take a standoffish attitude, getting involved as minimally as possible, hoping it would just kind of work itself out. But this is on national news, and it really kind of wakes up his conscience, and it starts to wake up the conscience of others. And so this is when we're really starting to see the change in terms of fighting de facto segregation, fighting customs and traditions. Martin Luther King is thrown in jail. While he is in jail, he writes his infamous letter from a Birmingham jail, where he says, "For years now I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied." And he basically goes on and on and on in this letter about how the time is now for change. African Americans are being mistreated. He, with the help of the NAACP and kind of the support of the governor and the president, he is eventually let go from jail. Overall, this protest is a win, not because they truly desegregate Alabama and bring about integration, but because it gets, the president and, the national government on support of integration. People start talking about passing a true new piece of civil rights legislation. In 1957, they attempted to pass civil rights legislation that truly integrated America, that protected people, but only minimal things have been done. And President Kennedy is about, equal employment, protecting black, white, men, women in the workplace, but still not a whole lot's been done. And then after this movement, this protest in Alabama, they're starting to talk about having maybe a march on Washington, perhaps getting a new Civil Rights Act passed, more legislation to protect all African Americans on a daily basis. You can't just have one protest to bring about change that protects everyone. Yet despite this fact, after this event, only 4 weeks later, 4 girls were killed in a church bombing.
The next major campaign was fought on even tougher ground.
It was probably the most violent and vicious racist city in the South. There had been 60 bombings of black people's homes in Birmingham in 61 and 62.
One target for the movement in Birmingham was to desegregate the schools. Alabama's governor, George Wallace, had promised they would stay white.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Our demonstrations in Birmingham were usually simply marches to the courthouse or to City Hall. And we almost never got more than 2 blocks from the church, and then we were arrested.
Day after day, hundreds of demonstrators filled the Birmingham jails. Among those arrested was the organizer of the Birmingham campaign, the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. By then, he was the acknowledged leader of the entire civil rights movement.
My heroes for the second half of the 20th century, Martin Luther King. All of these people are people who accepted the fact that you have to put everything online. Because if you don't, you're not going to get anything. Not in America. Because America is not going to change. Only you can change.
As part of the campaign, Dr. King enlisted an army of school children, aged 6 to 16. After the first day of demonstrations, nearly 1,000 of them had been herded into police vans and sent to jail. The next day, the police changed their tactics.
The law enforcement in Birmingham was headed by one Bull Connor. And Bull Connor was an old-fashioned lock them up, throw them in jail, throw away the key, beat them up, put dogs on them, hose them down with fire hoses. Anything he could think of to try to stop this movement by force, he did.
I watched the violence in Birmingham on TV. It shocked me to see the dogs being unleashed on people.
Exactly. It shocked so many people when you saw dogs being unleashed and fire hoses on people, and that's what really kind of woke up, American consciousness. Also, you at this time period, you heard Governor George Wallace and of Alabama, and he says segregation now, segregation, forever. And he is really opposed to any kind of integration or change. And eventually, as African American students, two of them are trying to enter the University of Alabama. George Wallace, the governor, stops them from attending school there. JFK has to send in federal troops to allow these students to attend because it's supposed to be integration now of public schools, even at the university level. And we know that basically then, since you couldn't stop the U.S. Army from letting African Americans attend schools, and it was only several, a few students here and there. For the most part, we didn't see a lot of African American students still enrolling in college, and many whites would withdraw from schools and go to separate, private, more expensive schools. But then the KKK and other groups started retaliating against African Americans. For example, Medgar Evers, who was head of the NAACP in Mississippi, he was shot and killed in his own driveway while getting in the car to go to an NAACP meeting. So, it was violent, incredibly, and for the most part, you've seen it's just been very non-violent protests by African Americans. So at this point, JFK is now finally in support of a civil rights bill during his last few months while he is in office before he's assassinated. And to try to gain even more support for this legislation and to show Congress they really should vote for it, they decide that there should be a rally, a march on Washington, led by Dr. King as he makes speeches and shows America that this is time for change, that it's time for true integration in all aspects of life, and we need a true law passed that forces the South to adhere to the national government's laws, that they are not supreme, and that ensures equality across America per our 14th Amendment.
Trying to raise congressional support for the Kennedy Civil Rights Bill, civil rights leaders called for a march on Washington. On August the 28th, 1963, more than 200,000 people showed up.
We knew it was a special day. And once I got there and saw the crowds coming from all over America, black and white, poor people, rich people, show business, politicians, Martin called it a coalition of goodwill, or a coalition of conscience that could change the soul of the nation on the race issue.
This was bringing a mass meeting into the homes of millions of Americans who were seeing this thing that I had seen over and over and over again in small town churches everywhere, seeing this for the first time and hearing the oratory of America's premier orator, Martin Luther King.
No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
I remember thinking when I saw Martin Luther King that he was going in his dream to bring the nation along, that he was irresistible in his call to mercy and love. I mean, that he was absolutely the most irresistible voice that had ever been heard.
Freedom and justice, I have a dream. My poor little children one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
So naturally, Martin Luther King has his I Have a Dream speech, which you've probably heard before, but it inspires millions of people to push for a Civil Rights Act. And even though JFK dies, the good thing is that LBJ becoming president, he's a huge supporter of civil rights, of changing poverty in America, of improving education. It's all part of his Great Society program. The best way to fight communists is to prove to the world America's a great country. He wants to decrease taxes. He creates food stamps. He's going to fight that war on poverty. He brings down poverty levels to half of what they were. Creates Project Head Start, to improve, and give free preschool to people. He gives out Medicare and Medicaid, to give, the elderly and the poor some kind of health insurance. He's all about, making a better country, and he really deeply cares about civil rights legislation. He was the one who helped initially create the Civil Rights Act of '57. And so he signs the Civil Rights Act of '64, which basically bans discrimination officially in all public facilities, in employment. You can't do it because of someone's race or color or religion or sexual orientation or national origin. And so this is getting us more into the modern era. And so the 14th Amendment, which calls for equal protection, is now going to get truly enforced. And the South can try to resist it all they want, but the president will use force and bring in the army if necessary. And so it's going to take time, but eventually people's, attitudes and values are going to change.
No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long.
So thinking about today as we wrap up, what was the significance of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? It's going to bring about true equality in America. And on Thursday, we're going to talk more about, really bringing about equality in America also through voting and ensuring that African Americans are allowed to really vote and run for office, and then how the civil rights movement changes over time with new leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., and how eventually, with Malcolm X, and how eventually Martin Luther King Jr. will be assassinated, which kind of brings the movement to a close. All right, guys, that's it for now. I know it was a long one. Have a great day.